is what you want to pay attention to for basically congressional disposition towards military spending, because it's not attached to any other bills. It's just, it delimits how much you can spend on the military per year. And then there's an appropriation cycle that sort of takes that framework and then fills in the gaps. So basically, President proposes and Congress disposes. And then there's two cycles: the policy process, which is the authorizations process, that's the NDAA. And then there's the actual like kind of fill in the blanks. But what you want to look at for military spending is the NDAA.
Yeah, fantastic. Yes, that's a good kind of framework for us to start off this conversation with. And also on that note, before we talk more about what Congress just voted on earlier this year during the summer, when both chambers of Congress were proposing the initial NDAA, Representatives Barbara Lee and Mark Pocan in the House and Senator Sanders and Markey in the Senate introduced an amendment to the NDAA that would have cut the Pentagon budget by 10%. So can you tell, how did that vote turn out, and why or how was this kind of a historic vote for Congress?
Glad you brought that up. The vote, which was brought in sort of, it was a mirroring sort of legislative initiative where the Senate had its own version for its version of the NDAA, and the House had its own version for its own NDAA. And basically the amendment, as you said, would cut Pentagon spending by 10%. So of the 740 authorized, that'd be 74 billion. And the beauty of the amendment, I think, is that it was written in such a way where those funds wouldn't just disappear. They would remain public funds, but be shifted into another account. Specifically, it went through this Treasury grant program, which would then admit it to, Department of Health and Human Services, Interior, or whoever does sort of like infrastructure stuff, and then EPA for environmental cleanup. That vote did not go well, even though there was a poll and members of Congress should have received word of this before they voted. But 70% of Democratic and Democratic-leaning voters, according to a poll from Data for Progress, said they would approve such a measure because, I mean, they're probably morally against military spending, and their life is probably extremely difficult, as are hundreds of millions of other people's are right now, who could use that 74 billion in social spending. And one thing that I think, I hope to see something like that again, but with a slightly or considerably higher number than 10%. And also, I think during the time in the lead up and the following, it should be marketed more as a jobs program than a national security or foreign policy thing, because I think that's the main selling point of converting money for the DoD and converting it to social programs. I mean, for the non, unusual observer of foreign policy, I guess, because if that amendment had passed and all that money had went to healthcare, it would have created 574,000 jobs over that same investment in defense. So if you're investing public funds to create jobs, defense is the absolute worst thing you can do. Healthcare is like twice as much, education is even more. So I think we can use that to sort of rally support in the lead up to the vote. And after the vote, I want like newspaper, journalists to, be able to write newspaper headlines that say, look, your member of Congress just voted against creating 500,000 jobs. And one more just point to wrap up this rant is that doing it in that way sort of encourages you to be more bold. So if a 10% conversion created, 500,000 jobs, the 20% one, I mean, ostensibly it's more radical because it takes more out of the Pentagon. But at the same time, it's also like, yeah, this is a bill this is an amendment that can be passed and it would create over 1 million jobs. And if you want to, up it again, double it again, 2 million jobs. So I think there was a real beauty to the amendment, and it's a pity that it didn't pass. But at least with that vote and with the research I did recently, we can kind of tell who are the members of Congress we can believe in and work with, and who are the ones who aren't so good. And rant.
Oh, right. No, I think that's so important. I'm really happy that you brought that up, right? Because I think that one of the most common arguments against cutting funding for the Pentagon budget is that it creates jobs, which is true. right? It does create jobs, but that argument is without understanding that within the context of, well, what if we spent that money on, for example, like you said, healthcare or education, or for example, a just transition, because we're talking about the fact that we need a Green New Deal because the climate crisis is so real right now. So that's really important. So thank you for bringing that up. And on that note, right, I did want to talk now a little bit more about what was just passed by Congress in the final NDAA. So can you kind of help us break down some of the contents of the bill? Because like we just discussed, there were some amendments initially that didn't get passed. But what actually did get passed in the final NDAA?
So my favorite two amendments from the summer were the one that you brought up earlier, the conversion amendment by Sanders in the Senate and Pocon in the House. And my other favorite one was just in the House. Ilhan Omar introduced it to withdraw all troops from Afghanistan within a year. So it sort of built in like a graceful way to withdraw from the country. Because I mean, I hope we're able to have this conversation more about, there's graceful and ungraceful ways to withdraw from countries to dismantle empire. So I think she nailed it in that bill, and both failed. What the NDAA did do, which just passed the Congress, is that it did sort of the opposite of those two things. It increased military spending from the year before. And if you're sort of keeping track, we're now over 130 billion from where we were at Obama's last military budget. So we're up there, and there's also limits on, it delimits how many troops can be withdrawn at a time from Germany, from Afghanistan, from South Korea. It basically entrenches empire and prevents Trump from withdrawing troops, which is like pretty much the only time in his 4 years he's been right about stuff, is when he's just trying to withdraw troops. Or I shouldn't say right, but just happened to be, adopting the right policy decisions. So yeah, I mean, Democrats really I really decided to look at Democrats here because, I mean, one is Trump's budget, and two, I mean, they were further off with their public opinion. I mean, again, Democrat and Democrat-leaning voters would vote the opposite way that that their representatives in Congress did. Right.
And we are going to obviously get to why there's that disconnect. I think everyone has a good sense of why. But also in this final NDA, you said, right, they voted to increase spending to $740.5 billion for the 2021, for the year of 2021. How does that, just to put that in perspective for people, how does that compare to military budgets that we've passed in the past couple of years and also kind of throughout history?
I mean, since the Korean War, we've had maybe one or two budgets that's been higher than now. I mean, peak Iraq War, and I think like maybe one other. So we're out there. It depends on which sort of budgets you count. Like if you count the nuclear stuff, if you count sort of the different accounts within DoD. But I mean, in terms of like where we're at, I mean, we're higher than the Korean War, than what we were spending in the Korean War. Same with Vietnam, and same with Reagan's infamous military buildup of the 1980s when he was talking about Star Wars and shit. Like, we're really, I mean, they say Medicare for all is pie in the sky, but like 740 billion, which is more than the next 10 countries combined. We spend more on police than Russia does on its entire military. I mean, it takes a lot of people at the same time going, what the fuck, and organizing to change the direction of this thing.
Right, and it's such an enormous number, right? I remember we had some conversations with staffers in Congress, like most people can't even comprehend that amount of money. Like, what are we actually using it for? And we'll get to that. So now that we've talked a little bit about the NDA and what's in it, let's kind of move on to this report that you put out about who voted for the final NDAA and the significance of their votes. So first, what was the final vote breakdown? And are there any notable no or yes votes that we should be aware of?
I think, it passed overwhelmingly in both chambers. In the House is 300, I have it written down here, 335 to 78. And then the Senate, it was also a blowout. It was like 87 to, or like 86 to 13 with like one abstaining or something. But in each in each chamber, more Republicans voted against the bill than Democrats, and they had their own reasons. I mean, some of them, I mean, may align with ours, probably not. So that was really the overall breakdown, is it passed overwhelmingly. And in terms of notable yeses and nos, probably who you'd expect. I should say that I know, like, at this time on Twitter, it seems pretty in vogue to be criticizing AOC and the squad, but I think that's totally fine. But I also would urge some politeness, because they are the best shots we've got in Congress. They've voted perfectly for the major votes that I kept track of: the last year's NDA, the House and final version, the Omar amendment, obviously, AOC's Twitch amendment, Pocon's amendment, and the 2 votes for this year's NDA. They voted perfectly, and there's only about 4 more of those who do that. I think Ro Khanna, Tulsi Gabbard are 2, and then 2 names I didn't even recognize, embarrassingly. And in the Senate, it was just sort of 6 out of the 7 recipients of military industrial cash. The bottom 7 recipients, 6 of them voted no. And it's pretty much who you'd expect: Senator Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, Cory Booker, Markey Merkley. So it's really just like who you'd expect, really, and then some names that I'm forgetting and not doing them justice. But those are people we can work with.
Yeah, right. I mean, those are obviously people we should keep an eye on. Obviously, the people who voted to cut the Pentagon budget by 10% and then also voted no on the NDAA, right?
Yeah.
That's a kind of discipline that's important. So also, though, right, let's talk a little bit more about this correlation between voting yes on military spending and campaign contributions from weapons contractors. You just spoke a little about in the Senate. Did those same findings hold true in the House?
Yeah, it wasn't quite as bad in the Senate or in the House as it was in the Senate. In the Senate, I found that comparing Democrats who voted yes versus no on this, massive military budget, those who voted yes received on average 6 times more war industry cash than those who voted no. In the House, is only 4 times as much. So you can say that, like, yeah, there's a larger problem here, that even if you took the bottom quartile of recipients in the House, it would still be like 70% voting yes or something. But I think the value in sort of making this, making these sorts of studies is that it provided sort of empirical proof from what all of us knew already and what we've been yelling about for years, even, and people have done this study before, but I always think it's useful to re-up the number, refresh it, make sure you're right, because I mean, you can't be accused of hyperbole then. You're really just saying, in response, no, we're just saying loudly what's happening, just corruption, So the votes, I wasn't expecting the votes to be that split, like 6 times in the Senate and 4 times in the House. And I think, ultimately, I think the value of the study is figuring out, who are the people we can talk to get the good votes, and who are the people who take so much money from the war industry that they're too tied to that Zeppelin, where it's better just to let them drift off. And it's not like we forget about them or the people in their district. It's just our attitude changes from, okay, legislative engagement on the Hill for certain bills versus political engagement, like, we're going to find a primary challenger for this person, because if we're going to get a positive vote from that district, it's not going to come from a person who's in the top half of war industry cash recipients. So I hope it provides some clarity in that way, and I hope it just makes people's lives easier in terms of the organizing thing.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's, I've seen this going around, and I know that it's gained kind of a lot of traction on Twitter. I think a lot of people might say, like you said, right, we already knew this, we don't need an empirical study, but actually we do, because first of all, right, these weapons companies have a lot of money. They spend a lot of that money on really great PR campaigns, and of course, to make sure that the politicians that they want in Congress are well funded. So being able to show that really clear connection is really important. And like you said, being able to use that to organize strategically is also really important. So I would really encourage everyone to look at this report, and I'll make sure everyone who signed up for the webinar gets it. We'll also put it out on our Twitter feed as well. So please make sure everyone goes and look at that. But I also wanted to talk a little bit about, we've talked about this correlation between military funding for campaigns for military contractors and their votes on these spending bills. And, CODEPINK recognizes the very obvious conflict of interest that occurs, right, when our representatives are essentially bought and sold by the same companies that they authorize funding for when they vote for bills like the NDAA, which is why we encourage everyone to use our resources to demand that their congressional representatives stop taking campaign contributions from weapons contractors. You can go to opensecrets.com, type in your congressperson's name, and see how much money they receive. But is there anything else you think we can be doing to help kind of draw attention to and end this kind of very obvious conflict of interest?
I think just finding the best people in Congress, which is the squad, Mark Pocan, Barbara Lee in the House, and Senator Sanders in the Senate, basically to use their political power to draw attention to this issue. Because, I mean, of the squad, none of them really take that much military industrial complex cash or war industry cash. AOC does take a lot, like well over the mean, but she's also a fundraising juggernaut. And judging by her voting patterns, she clearly doesn't need it. So if she doesn't need it, like, you might as well do something, impactful for the institution. And you can also work through like Jamal Bowman and Cori Bush, who I expect will be rock stars in foreign policy, just because, I mean, just hearing these people talk, it's like, whoa. But I think working through them to sort of take like a social, like normative pledge saying, I'm going to reject all military industrial complex cash, and just sort of as sort of an informal pledge, and see which ones of their peers or colleagues will sign on. And then once you have sort of a list of people or constituency who has signed on to this pledge, those are the people who are going to be your co-sponsors for a campaign finance reform act thing where it barred, where you cannot take military industrial complex cash. So those will be the people you introduce that sort of legislation with. And then, I mean, ultimately the goal is nationalization. That's the only way to delink profit in questions of war and peace. But I don't want to give off the impression that it's sort of nationalization or bust, because there's really cool stuff with that nationalization as the goal. There's really cool stuff we can accomplish in the meantime, that not only is a positive legislative thing, but also builds awareness. And the last one might be just to highlight how military spending perpetuates inequality, which is the enormous CEO salaries of these companies. I mean, in the federal government, I think there's a rule where the top earners, like presidents and like secretaries of defense or whatever, cabinet level positions, they can only earn like 5 or 6 times the median federal employee salary. But at these defense corporations, it's routine to see a $20 million salary when like Mark Esper at DoD was making $210,000. Not saying that makes him a good person, because he was making millions at Raytheon, but I think just like kind of tying those things together and introducing a law like, hey, listen, like Lockheed Martin's CEO earned 20 million or received 20 million last year, and that inside Lockheed Martin itself is 300 times the median employee. So you can sort of say, okay, if your company takes over 50% of its revenue from the federal government, you have to adhere to the federal government rules. And of course, I mean, that's like, in terms of dismantling the war machine, that's a small effort, but it would be, kind of a big deal and draw attention to the issue. And who wouldn't like to, flip the bird to, the corporate executives of the military industrial complex. I mean, we all need sort of like that sort of a little refreshing from time to time, because it's a long fight.
I completely agree. I think that's really interesting. Could you actually speak a little bit about your idea about nationalization? I don't think most people would have heard that before.
Yeah. So you may have heard it like with oil. There's some cries for that. But the thing about, nationalizing the defense industry is that it basically already is nationalized because, as I said, most of these companies rely heavily on, contracts awarded out through DoD. So just to explain that real fast, half of DoD's annual budget is awarded to the private sector via contracts. Christian Sorensen wrote an entire book on this called Understanding the War Industry. And he also wrote an article for SPRI, my think tank, that kind of lays out like this entire economy that's built around these war industry contracts. And basically that's the pool of public subsidies available to these major weapons manufacturers. So if they can't guarantee that a specific project they're doing will be funded, they'll just lobby to increase like the amounts available so they can kind of like figure it out amongst themselves. And they are, because they keep eating each other. But the goal of nationalization is just to formalize that system that's already in place. So if 70 to 90% of Lockheed's annual revenue is coming from the government, then why is there even a private industry to begin with? And if the military industrial complex in the defense industry or war industry was nationalized tomorrow, we'd still be spending a ton on defense, but all of a sudden, all that money spent on lobbying, campaign finance, bankrolling shitty think tanks that Jan Weinberg talked about on your program a few weeks ago, as you mentioned earlier. I like Jan. And really there's just a removal, just a disappearance by nationalizing the war industry of all these external pressures on members of Congress, the public, with the advertising at Nationals games. It's like, leave me alone. All that stuff suddenly disappears. And you're left with just a lot of public resources at your disposal where you can then say, okay, let's just retrofit all these facilities, all the workers who are like in them, or, however many is converted, taking the workers of the military industrial complex, like having, providing them new jobs in green energy or whatever. And the best part of that is you easily cover the spread. So you can take literally everyone from the war industry, and then every two could invite a mutual friend to work, in the green economy because of the disparity between spending on defense and green energy in terms of job disparity. So it's really an exciting proposition. And really, I don't think it should be like characterized as like radical or cool or an original idea at all on my behalf, because in the late 60s, like John Kenneth Galbraith wrote an op-ed saying defense firms are really public firms and should be nationalized. I think that was literally the title of his article. So I think we should just have to keep pushing towards that and not just talk about it in terms of cuts, but all the productive stuff we could do by just not spending money like total maniacs.
Right. And I think that idea and that conversation really brings to the fore like the absurdity that is, we have these companies that make a profit from going to war, and then they can also spend just a portion of their profit to make sure that they continue to get more and more profit every year. So basically, it's just a really great return on their very small investment every year, right? So I think that's a really important conversation to have, and I appreciate it. It's really interesting. And so on that note, I'm wondering, is there anything else you wanted to end with? And how can people follow and support your work?
I think following CODEPINK's work is really important because, we do a lot of stuff advising, advocacy, but not the real work that needs to be done in terms of the organizing. But I hope, as we continue to get funded, and if you want to support us, patreon.com/SPRI, SPRI, you can do so there. And we're working on other fundraising platforms. But I think the main thing you can do is sort of try not to let these results get you down or get too cynical, because I think that's sort of a ruling class strategy, is to sort of make people zone out of politics and just sort of throw their hands up. So I'd encourage you to stay involved. I think, CODEPINK has all the resources in terms of like it networks well. I don't mean to make you uncomfortable with flattery. It's just, you guys just do a tremendous job. And I also write from this newsletter called Speaking Security on Substack that you can follow once or twice a week, with just sort of breakdowns of issues that I think are timely and important. And I try to make them, I try to use a graph in every one, or a chart of some sort, and basically deliver information I think is important in the least number of words possible.
Perfect. Well, I know a lot of people would appreciate that. But also, you know, some of the resources that you mentioned, right? If people want to go to codepink.org/divest, you can find, we have a pledge on our website asking congressional representatives, actually demanding that our congressional representatives stop taking campaign contributions from weapons manufacturers, which, like we've discussed, is just the tip of the iceberg, but it's an important first step. So I want to go ahead and thank you, Stephen, for joining us. We're going to go ahead and end the live portion of our recording today.